of my talk. The talk is titled Absolutely Positively Not Hacking Back. Subtitle is Streaming Unexpected Network Byte Sequences with a High Probability of Blue Screening or Otherwise Crashing Command and Control Nodes. If there were a prize for longest and most ridiculous talk title, I think I would win. So very quick, we'll talk about who I am, why I'm here. I was legally compelled to give a disclaimer about hacking back. Very briefly, I will touch on command and control ecosystems, so C2 throughout the duration of me talking means command and control, and some ways that are really easy to explore and stress test effectively command and control systems with network traffic. And then finally, I'll pivot to that to some maybe defensive ideas on how one might operationalize these kind of stress tests against command and control nodes. So quickly about me, again, I'm a researcher with FireEye. I tend to study incident response types of data, new malware families, new attacker techniques. My focus is on adversary methods, so tradecraft, really focusing on how attacks happen, not necessarily what or who or why. I'm really into things like Snort and Yara. I play Battlefield 5 on PC, and I like science fiction novels. Historically, I'm a retired forensicator, so I used to do dead disk forensics and stuff like that. I worked for a big university which had maybe had an APT1 problem back in 2008. And then a long time ago, I was in the US Army, and I worked at the National Security Agency as a signals intelligence analyst. So signals intelligence, and there's a reason I'm bringing this up, because it's helped shape how I think about malware and communications protocols. But signals intelligence is all about collecting traffic from communication systems, usually cell phones, radios, satellites, that type of thing, decoding that and extracting intel from it. So SIGINT is my frame of reference for how I look at all this computery stuff, which I got into later. So up front, my thesis points are that command and control systems and protocols are really fragile. So when you have an implant, a malware implant that talks to a C2 controller, they're talking by a certain language, but all of this is built to be just good enough to work. The attackers and the malware developers are not going through QA processes. They're not checking their code with other people. They're developing it on the fly, and they're deploying it on the fly. And they put most of their effort actually into their implants, because they want those to run successfully on their victim machines. So not built for availability, not built to be poked by anything other than an implant. So they are weak, they are vulnerable, and I believe that defenders can take advantage of these weaknesses, these fragilities, and these vulnerabilities. Notice I'm not seeing the word exploit. Not hacking back. So the disclaimer. This is my personal research. I work for FireEye, but do not conflate my personal research with what FireEye does. FireEye does not hack back. FireEye will not hack back. I have to make it especially clear that I am advocating for defensive actions only, not hacking back. My legal team will be pleased that I made this disclaimer. Okay, so real quick, when I say C2 ecosystem, I'm talking about three main things. You got the implant, used to be called a backdoor or a piece of malware, which terminology has evolved. This is typically on a victim system. You have the controller. This is the C2 server. It is this C2 controller, the C2 panel, the manager program, and that is meant to give an operator access to those implants to help manage them. And that is resident on attacker-controlled infrastructure, usually. And then you have all these other things kind of in the middle. And you have the C2 protocol. And this is comprised of different message types and a language and a certain etiquette that the controller expects and also the implant expects. So they have to kind of agree on how they talk to each other, and expectations are built on both sides into how that happens. Controllers come in many shapes and sizes. So the very basic ones are accessible from a command shell. This is an APT16 controller from like, I don't know, 100 years ago. And somebody was a Star Trek fan who wrote this, because shuttle pod, report to the bridge, etc. But this one's funny because every time it opens up a listener and every time an implant reports in, it actually opens up a new shell window, and another one, and another one, and another one. And so you can imagine if you're controlling dozens of implants or across, dozens of victims, that would be really terrible. So now there are these, fancier, click GUI kind of controller systems, and they give an attack operator the ability to manage all their implants and sort them and export them into spreadsheets and all sorts of stuff. And it gives dumb operators like me the ability to just kind of point and click what I want to point and click in order to control those implants. So in studying all of those C2 controllers, it's been my observation that a lot of them, especially the ones that operate on binary protocols, are very fragile. They're very buggy, they crash all the time, and this is for a couple of reasons. That C2 protocol, where we're having messages sent back and forth in between the implant and the controller, for C2 protocols that are like HTTP based, they tend to be much more stable because you're using higher level Windows APIs, for example, and that has things like network handling and all sorts of stuff, right? But when you get down to the binary protocols, and I'm talking about, they're not human readable, these are raw bytes sent over sockets, for example, using low-level APIs. And that means the controller and the implant have to do a lot more to manage the network streams that go back and forth and validate the network streams that go back and forth and manage memory and stuff like that. So I came to the conclusion that these would be really easy to mess with and to knock down. And throughout my research, definitely able to use like network traffic in order to cause unintended things on C2 controllers. So here's kind of how my lab looks up. And anybody can set this up, right? If you got an implant, you got a controller, and you usually want a proxy in the middle. And so for the purposes of this presentation, and one of our favorite ones, PlugX, this is what I was set up in the demonstration I'll sort of walk through today. And because this is a binary TCP protocol, not all the normal proxy programs will work. So you could, if it were HTTP based, you could use something like Burp or Fiddler to kind of mess with the protocol that's going back and forth between the implant and the controller. But because I'm doing a binary protocol, I need something different. I'm using a program called Canapé, which is on GitHub if you want to check it out. And to simplify it and make the graphics a little bigger, I put it on one virtual machine, both the implant and the proxy, and then on the right side I have the controller running in Azure. I spun that up and just kind of sat that in the cloud so we could talk to it. So on the left-hand side, you see, that's the proxy, and you see those lines, that's the log of the traffic going back and forth between the implant and the controller. And on the right-hand side, you see that cool GUI, and that's how the attack operator manages all those implants. And those are all each different implants, and it gives biographical information on the implants, yada, yada, yada. So I'm going through my research, and I'm just having fun messing with these things, right? I'm looking at the bytes that are going back and forth between these things, and I honestly don't know much about the protocol, but I've started Wireshark, and I'm collecting my Pcap, and I'm just kind of looking at what's going on, looking at that conversation that's going back and forth between the implant and the controller. So I start just doing basic network fuzzing. I'm playing packets fast, I'm playing packets slow, I'm doing big packets, little packets, writing different offsets, and I injected one packet, like 928 bytes, and it causes the program to crash completely silently. It just vaporizes, disappears from my controller VM sitting in the cloud. So okay, well, that's fun and all, but I want to make it like more fantastic. I want to see it really just grind to a halt and die in a loud and fiery crash. So I go back and I reset my VMs, and I'm looking at the traffic, and I decide to just add a bunch of LOLs into some of the packets and just see what happens to that controller. So again, the controller is expecting that the only person that's talking to it is the implant, and the implant will never send the controller something that it doesn't like, because it's all based on expectation. So there are varying amounts of validation that happen in these network streams, and that's what fuzzing is really all about, is seeing how you can tweak inputs and get different types of outputs. So instead of sending it one packet, I decided to send it 100,000 packets, just to see kind of what happens. And I do this a bunch of different times. I'm sending, again, I'm going back, I'm sending 100,000 packets, I'm sending 10, I'm sending them different orders, and I'm able to get the controller to cough up a lot of like error messages and failures. So we get an assertion error, and this actually shows some of the original linked code that the author, the infamous WHG, one of the many authors of PlugX, some assertion failure, system error, code 8. I don't know if you know about that. We get some sort of, this looks like a memory error. That one does not look good. Doesn't like that. PE decode packet error was like another thing. And then the always helpful, the blank error. So you kind of get the impression that, it is a step in the right direction that there are error messages. They don't always pop up. There are messages or errors that just crash the entire program, but there are error messages when the controller program is receiving traffic it's not ready for, it just doesn't really like. And I wanted to do a better job of making that happen, so I produced a small video of a crash in progress, and I tried for the loudest possible, worst possible looking crash that I could do just for fun. And this is what that looks like. I will brace you. I did all the video production and graphics on this, and I'm available for freelance work if you wish to check it out. So I'm running all my packet fuzzing on the left-hand side. I'm resizing the window, make sure the program isn't hung, and just kind of hovering here. And then something happens. I get my spinny weight wheel, and then I get 100 assertion errors. I get some sort of PE decode. Windows is noticing that it's hung and says, do you want to close it? And I said, no, I actually want to keep it going. So I hit cancel, and then it just blows up and crashes anyway. And so again, like, I have no knowledge of this protocol. I'm just injecting a lot of packets and sending it a lot of garbage that it's just not prepared to handle. And so this is one of those ways, if this is true for PlugX, this is likely true for a lot of other controllers. And in my research, I've been able, for binary communications protocols, this is really common. They're not ready to handle all of the different things you could throw at it. So again, I did about 100 runs of this in different forums, took all my, started all my Pcap and recorded it. And I was noticing the handshake routines, and that's where I think the best opportunity is for streaming unexpected network bytes, the high probability of blue screening or crashing command and control nodes. And the handshake routine itself is really key, because with a lot of implant or command and control frameworks, the implant sometimes has a password in order to authenticate to the controller. So I ran this about 100 times, and the really catastrophic error that you just saw in the video was me adding a couple LOLs and then like 10,000 smiley faces just for fun. But notice that that came after the authentication, which is really key. So out of probably like 100 goes at this, I stopped counting at 15, but I had a lot of crashes. I definitely had one blue screen, and I wasn't able to reproduce that, so I'm not quite sure why that happened. It could have been for a variety of reasons. Any regular Windows reason could have happened for. And I got silent failures as well. And the silent failures are really interesting because what happened was, you would replay some traffic and send a bunch of crap to the C2 controller, and it would disconnect the implant. Something in the control program would die, and it wouldn't tell you as the attack operator that the controller was actually dead. So you have a controller that looks like nothing happened, yet the implants are not able to authenticate. They're not able to update on your screen. So there's an interesting opportunity there for, to cause the attacker some confusion or cause their controller to fail, and they have no idea that it has in fact failed. So everything about causing adverse reactions to a command and control node or an attacker themselves. It's about raising the cost of that attack operation, making them less effective at what they're doing. So again, the weaknesses matrix for command and control systems, and this is especially true for the ones that do binary communications protocols. Before there is a hello, before you say hello to that controller, the controller has basically no presence. It has an open port, and you can do a port scan, and you could do a GET request on it, and that controller is not going to respond unless you give it something that it kind of expects to be getting. Then you have the hello, and this is where you start to have initial, the surface of that controller is opening up a bit. So there are ways to cause controllers to crash during that authentication or hello sequence where an implant is registering with its controller. And then finally, you have the post-hello after the implant has authenticated to the controller. This is where it is totally easy to break everything in a C2 controller. And so I'm thinking about all this when I'm doing my research, and in the spirit of not hacking back, there are defensive actions that I think people can take, and people can use these types of capabilities to better defend their networks through streaming network bytes. So the scenario is you are compromised. It is time for an incident response. And you have a lot of different things that you could do. Most people will either quarantine their infected systems, which reduces immediate impact to those systems, but you sacrifice some OPSEC. And so there are all these trade-offs you can make in how you do an incident response or remediation, but almost all of them involve telling the attacker that you are, you're doing some defensive work. And when you tip your hand to the attacker and let them know that you're responding, you risk them broadening or deepening their intrusion in different places. So kind of think about, okay, well, what can we do to these victim machines or for these victim machines that will either protect ourselves or give us an advantage or perhaps give the attacker a disadvantage? And so, again, we're talking about, back to my signals intelligence days, I'm thinking about this, the controller and the implant, and this is a communication system to me, and there's a lot of ways you can damage or harm or adversely impact communication systems. And in order to think about that, I try to think about an implant differently. An implant is an invitation to a party. You are added to the guest list. You are given the address to the party, and you're given the secret password to get in. And when you start thinking about that, that's really important because the attacker has no reasonable expectation of privacy, which is the basis for most laws against hacking back. So if the implant is your invitation to the party, and we're thinking about disrupting a communication system, you can kind of think about ways with your technology you could, take the victim implants and sync them to something like a proxy. And I'm using the word proxy. This could be a virtual machine. It could be an endpoint agent. And it could be whatever, some sort of security product. And if you are able to sync your implants to a proxy, your real victim machines, and if you can detect the traffic that they're sending, the malicious, C2 protocol, you could have some if this, then that routines, such as if this stream is a plug X, allow a handshake to happen, and then rewrite some of my own victims' bytes. And they're my bytes because they're coming out of my network, and I own them, and they are from my own victims. And I don't think anybody's going to fault you for overwriting the bytes coming from a compromised system, right? Because you're doing that to protect yourself. So back to the disrupting communication system, there's this acronym that we use in the signals intelligence world, MIJI, M-I-J-I. And the first, I try to use this to think about an incident response strategy. So the first strategy is meekening. Basically, you're showing up to that party in a costume. So if you sync your implant to the proxy, you intercept and rebroadcast, the beaconing data from that implant, and you say, hey, it's not, my real host name. This is something else. I'm somebody else entirely. And the purpose of that would be to, protect your OPSEC. You're not just quarantining it, and quarantining it is a surefire way to tell an attacker that they're not doing a good enough job. But maybe you protect some OPSEC this way, and they don't quite know you're responding. So falsify the data, show up to the party in a costume. The next one is interference. So again, you have your victim sunk to the proxy, and this time you're showing up to the party, but you're talking real slow. So you could do something like throttle the traffic down to 10 bits per second. I don't know if you've ever operated at 10 bits per second, but it is excruciating. And that would do something to frustrate the attacker, or at least make their operation of their implants much, much harder. You could also do something like bit flipping. So for example, if the attacker is trying to transfer encrypted RAR files, if you start flipping bits every couple of packets, it's going to make it much less likely that they'll be able to successfully decrypt those packets, and if there is something stolen, that they'll actually be able to use it. You could also do something like, you are allowing all the outbound beacons, so it seems like the implant is reaching that controller, but you don't allow any inbound commands. And now the attacker, they're going to have no idea what's going on. The implant is there, it's accessible to them through their malware panel, their control panel, but they can't do anything. And again, you may sacrifice some OPSEC there, but you might protect some as well, and you're definitely making it harder for them to do their jobs, and that's what it's all about. Jamming, and this is something where you're syncing your implant to the proxy, and you're basically doing what I was doing in that video, where you show up to the party and you just start screaming for no reason, and basically people at a party won't like that. But if you show up to the party, you rewrite some of your own victim's traffic, and if the controller can't handle that, that's their problem. That's not your problem. If they can't handle that and that crashes their controller, 100% their problem. Their party was not equipped for that. That's their fault, and I'm cool with that. And last but not least, intrusion. Intrusion in a different perspective. This is not computer network intrusion like we often talk about in the computery world, but intrusion on a communications network. So what if you showed up to that party, but you brought 1,000 friends? So if you had a victim machine, what if you cloned it 1,000 times, 100 times? And now all of those victim machines are trying to get into that party all at once. The side effect of this, I'm not saying it would be a denial of service, but it might cause that party to get shut down. Most parties can't support 1,000 guests. If they're all reaching at once, this is like a flash mob. So most controllers can only handle a certain amount of implants. Now, if you occupy all of those spaces on that C2 controller, then implants all around the world would never be able to reach that controller. So you can successfully kind of intrude on that communications network. So that's MIGI. Those are the ways that I think about impacting an adversarial communication system. And so the takeaways of this are pretty simple. The C2 ecosystems are very fragile, and it does not require a ton of intentional exploitation or anything like that to take them down. You can take them down, and your implant is your invitation. Because you own your network traffic, if you decide, if you are a genuine victim of an attack, if you decide to rewrite the bytes from your victim assets, you definitely can take down a controller. And I don't think anybody will fault you for that. These options are definitely for people who have a high appetite for risk taking. There are obviously legalities and all sorts of stuff, and if you do tip off the attackers that you're responding, you invite different risks. So there's some risk-reward calculus that you have to take if you want to do these things, but you definitely can adversely impact, defensively impact attacker control nodes, and I hope that this has at least given a couple of folks a new way to think about that. So thank you very much.